This is Los Angeles City Fire Station 30, Truck 11. This station is no longer a working fire station, but is now home to the African American Firefighters Museum here on Central Avenue. It's a monument to a civil rights movement that began within these walls. Just as it was in the South, for decades, segregation was just the way it was, until a group of young firemen saw it for what it really was, the wall that stood between them and advancement and opportunity on the job. It's a generation of African American firefighters who are making their own strides, strides which will benefit the next generation. The firefighter civil rights movement made a few headlines and rattled City Hall. Many of the original players have long since passed on, unheralded for their many sacrifices. We're going to take a journey which starts here and touches on the people, places, and events that have shaped the face of firefighting in the city and county of Los Angeles. Our guides will be the leaders of their generations, with additional perspectives provided by those who have benefited from what began here. These are the men and women of Engine Company X. In the late 1800s, slavery was still a very fresh memory. Lynchings were a fact. Hopelessness for the Negro in the South was incurable. Those who had the will fled the South. Many settled in New York, Baltimore, or Chicago, while others pushed even farther west. Los Angeles was a city in its infancy. Great weather, undeveloped land, and a promise of opportunity and renewal drew people from all over, especially the Negro.
When the black porters and waiters would come to Los Angeles in the middle of January and see the sun shining, they'd whistle to their family, "Y'all come." And they started staying in those little rooming houses on Ceres and Gladys that branch off of Central Avenue. And then gradually the Central Avenue became the street for the black community.
Prior to 1886, the pueblo known as Los Angeles was served by a group of mostly white volunteer firemen. One black man, Sam Haskins, served with them and later on the newly formed Los Angeles City Fire Department, unsegregated. Arnett Hartsfield is a retired Los Angeles City fireman. Hartsfield would become the premier historian of the African American firefighter experience in Los Angeles. Besides being an expert, he is also a contributor to that history.
A black fireman was killed the year before that group picture was taken. That's why he doesn't appear. I don't know when he came on, haven't found out yet, but he died in 1895. He died on the way to a fire. He fell off of engine 3 or hose 3, was crushed by the rear wheels. I have asked Captain Jimmy Hill to check the roster of 3s, and he doesn't show up. I think I know the reason. I now hear that he was assigned to engine 4. But I believe in those days, most of the firemen were call men. There was only one paid man at the station. When an alarm came in, all of the call men grabbed the first thing smoking. And I think what happened, Haskins saw 3s going by, and he joined 3s. Because that's not his station, again, I'm assuming, but I think I'm right, he didn't have a regular seat. So when they hit a bump, he lost his balance and fell off and was crushed by the rear wheels. We are now engaged in the process of properly documenting his grave, which is in Evergreen.
His funeral was attended by blacks and whites, many of them prominent members of the department and government. No known pictures of Haskins exist.
We could not be buried in any cemetery other than Evergreen in Boyle Heights. And there we were segregated, but at least we could be buried there.
Prior to the discovery of Haskins, this man was recognized as the first black L.A. fireman.
Bright was the first black fireman. Joined the department October 2nd, 1897. I understand he had been a longshoreman before he joined the department. Being the only black on the department, he was not segregated. He was stationed at Engine 3, became a driver at Engine 3. The second black fireman came on 3 years later, 1900, William W. Glenn. Glenn has the distinction of being the second black fireman, but also the third black policeman in the city of L.A. Let me tell you why. Bright and Glenn heard two rumors in about 1902. The first rumor was, as soon as there's 5 blacks on the job, we're going to segregate them. The second rumor was, civil service is going to start in 1903. Glenn was intellectually smarter than Bright, but Bright was no dummy. I guess that's why his name was Bright. Glenn anticipated that under civil service he'd be the lieutenant. Bright figured that out, so he went to the chief and asked to be made the lieutenant in anticipation of the segregated company. It sounds strange to us because we're used to civil service. Prior to civil service, everything was based on seniority. He had 3 years on Glenn. So they made him a lieutenant, gathered the 5 blacks together, put them in that separate station up on Belmont Avenue, which is now Loma Drive. That upset Glenn, because Glenn had anticipated that under civil service he'd be the lieutenant. So he transferred to the police department in 1904. And sure enough, when he retired in about, when that picture was taken of him in about 1918, he was already detective lieutenant, acting captain in the segregated Newton Street, right? The next street over and halfway down the block. He did all the work of a captain, but he got a lieutenant's pay. And he did never make captain, but he did make lieutenant. And certainly, had civil service been used, had they waited for civil service for our first company, Glenn would have been our first officer. But William E. Hall was our first officer under civil service.
In 1903, the department's 5 blacks were gathered up and moved to what was known as the Hill.
All firemen are clannish. You have to remember, the fire service is a little bit different than most jobs. You eat and sleep together. And the white firemen said that the Constitution guaranteed their right to pick with whom they should eat and sleep. I said, quite the contrary.